So we pray. Amen. So uh, the last time we had an opportunity, we were looking at constructing lines, and we might not review all that we did, like because of time. But the key point that I'd like us to remember from the previous study is that in the light of the study we were doing, the history of modern Israel, in that light was the history of the Christian church in the entire face, like in the light of the seven churches in Revelation chapter 2 and 3. So I think that is going to be important. So I'd not wish to go back to that study, but how I want to advance this study is going to the book of Matthew chapter 24. So I want us to look at Matthew chapter 24, though not in details. My purpose, all the reason why I'm going to Matthew chapter 24, it's because there is something that I'd like us to meet that is going to be important in our study. So I'm not going to go through to all the details that we already know about Matthew chapter 24. I'll just go there, pick a point, and that point is going to be important in this study. So, so Matthew chapter 24, the first thing that I'd like to establish is the historical context, like the time frame, all the period, the historical year which Matthew chapter 24 is being written. So, in an attempt to establish that, I'd like us to go to the book of John. So, we'll go to John chapter 1, and then we are coming back to Matthew chapter 24. So, if we go to the book of John chapter 1, so this is a book that all of us are familiar. So, John chapter 1, Panther. So, in John chapter 1, what do you think is the theme that John chapter 1 is dealing with? Summary. Okay, summary is not a good word. I think that the theme is a good word to use. What do you think is the theme of John chapter 1? Sorry? Right. Just us. What do you think is the theme of John chapter 1? Speak loudly. The Godhead. Right? Uh-huh. Where do you get the impression that is the Godhead? Sorry? Yes, I think that is a fair answer. So if you look at John chapter 1, verse 1, we'll be discussing about the word. So if you read a few verses up to around verse 13, verse 13, 14, you realize that the word in John chapter 1 is Christ. So, and then what we'll do is, so John chapter 1 will be discussing about the word. So I don't have time to go through that, but if you read keenly, you'll see, you realize that the word in John chapter 1 is Christ. So basically, what we have in John chapter 1 is going to discuss about the life of Christ. So John will labor to show us that the word is Christ, and then it will begin telling us different events that happened in the life of the word, in the life of Christ. Okay? All right. So now I want to ignore all the verses and go to verse 29. All right? So if you go to verse 29 of John chapter 1, it's going to take you to a specific event that is happening in the life of the Word, in the life of Christ. So Jeff, in verse 29, which event are we in? Baptism of the Word. So which year is that, Jeff? 27 AD. So I'd like to start there. So if you go to John chapter 1 and we are in verse 29, that will be 27 AD. And our reason is that you see the baptism of the Word. So that is the baptism of Christ. Right? So, Ken, which specific period in 27 AD are we in? Like the period of the year, the season of the year. A year has the beginning, the middle, and the end. So where are we in verse 29? Winter? Why? Why winter? Ochola, verse 29. Are you there? So which period, which time of the year are we in verse 29? So I'll rephrase the question. Christ is baptized in 27 AD, right? So which period in 27 AD is Christ baptized? Right. Pamela? Do you have an idea, Joe? Okay. Seko. Why spring? No, I mean like what you are saying is correct, all Ken. I mean in the Jewish year, we had the year used to run from spring to spring. If I've not forgotten Ezra 7:9. So we had spring, summer, autumn, and then winter. So I'm asking, we are in 27 AD, we are seeing the baptism of Christ. Remember, the reason why we've gone to John chapter 1, it's an attempt to establish the historical setting of Matthew chapter 24. So that is why I want to be specific about the time period we are when we are speaking about the baptism of Christ. So,
Because according to our current calendar, it would tell us that the baptism is happening around something January. So
I don't know, you're the one telling me.
you're looking for ideas. No, maybe I'm just thinking on your ideas.
All right. No, you are asking me right, and I don't know if it's right.
Okay, I think it is great. Maybe somebody else would also say.
Okay. Nick.
I used to know in the past, but I don't know.
Right, Joy?
I'd say spring because of well, I'd maybe backdate it. The death happens in autumn. This is the 10th day of the seventh month. That's when Passover used to happen. 10th day of the
Yes.
seventh month.
Yes.
And the death was 3.5 years after the baptism. So 3.5
Oh,
years.
the crucifixion you mean happens in the 10th day of the 7th month? Okay. I think so. Because I mean, let me just go. If we go to Leviticus 16 and I believe 23, it will give us like the festives that are used to happen in the Jewish era. Sindio? And there used to be 7 of them. So one that I can remember, one of them used to be the Passover. And this happened on the 14th day of the first month. Sindio? Then after that, we used to have first fruit. No, unleavened bread. This 15th day of the first month, then we used to have the first fruits. And this used to happen on the 16th day of the first month. So there are two others, and then we have, we used to have Pentecost. And Pentecost is 50 days after the Passover. So it's still happening in the first phase of the year. And then we are used to have 4 at the start of the year, 3 at the end of the year. So among them is the 10th day of the first month to liturgy, atonement. Yes, so those are the last 3, right? My understanding is when Christ dies, he dies as a Passover lamb. So that happens on the 14th day of the first month, which is the spring. So it cannot be the autumn. So let me try and so we'll read a quote. I think we can do that from Daniel chapter 9, but because of time we read a quote, and I want us to go to Great Controversy 326 paragraph. We can try paragraph 3. When someone is there can read. I think I'll confirm if it's the one.
It says, in the 7th chapter of Ezra, the decree is found. That is verses 12 to 6. In its completest form, it is issued by Artaxerxes, the king of Persia, by 457 BC. But in Ezra 6:14, the house of the Lord at Jerusalem is said to have been built according to the commandment decree margin of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. These 3 kings, in originating, reaffirming, and completing the decree, brought it to the perfection required by the prophecy to mark the beginning of the 2300 years. In 457 BC, the time when the decree was completed, as the dates of the commandment, every specification of the prophecy concerning the 70 weeks was seen to have been fulfilled.
All right. So I think I need you to read the next one that confirms that the 7th week specifically starts in the atom of 457 BC. Should be 327 all prior to that. Don't have the quote with me.
Verse 1 says,
Uh-huh.
the going forth of the commandments to restore and to build Jerusalem unto the Messiah,
Yeah.
things shall be 7 weeks and 3 score and 2
All right.
weeks, namely 69 weeks,
Uh-huh.
or 483 years.
Okay.
The decree of Artaxerxes went into effect in the autumn of 457.
So I think that is what I wanted. So I'm assuming this is going to be the 23. This is going to be the 23 years because the 23 years starts the same time as the 70. We are all familiar with that. And that will start in 457, but it will start in the atom. Right? The atom of 457 AD. So we'll have the 70, and that is 1844 when the 2300 years ends. Right? So the 70 will take us to which year? When does the 70 end? 34. Sindio? See, that is the 70 basically is the 490. See, this 490 and that is 1810. Right? So the 70 starts in the atom of 457 AD and is going to end in 434 AD. So I'm saying if it starts in the atom of 457 AD, then it has to end in the atom of 34 AD. Sindio? See, it's like how you count your birthday. Right? Faith. If you are born in February, so you will celebrate the next birthday in February. So if the decree goes forth in the atom, it's going to end at the same time, in the atom of 34 AD. Right? So then we know before that, so this is going to be 69 and this the 1 week. Then in this 1 week, we have the midst of the week. All right? So that is going to be 3.5. That is going to be 3.5. All right. So I'm saying, okay, without even going through demonstrating to that, so if you go back 1 week, which brings you to 27 AD, when if you go to Daniel chapter 9, is the baptism of Christ. So the baptism of Christ has to be in the atom of 27 AD. All right. So I know we can go through a lot of myriad of histories to show that, but the basic form is that the same time it started, it has to end in that time. So Christ, the only logical sense is that Christ is baptized in the atom of 27 AD. Right? Any question up to that point? Are we clear? Yes.
Just a comment about the crucifixion, when the crucifixion happened.
Mhm.
I don't know how they usually calculate like Easter weekend, but I find it to be very accurate in terms of the timing. So, like in the Bible, they usually say the crucifixion was around Passover, and if you look at
No, the crucifixion of Christ happened on the 14th day of the first month.
yeah,
If you go to Desire of Ages, it's Ellen White will confirm that. So it happens on the 14th day of the first month, which is the Passover.
that's why they even had like Passover with the disciples before the crucifixion. Yeah. So today, I think Easter is usually accurate in terms of the the weekend, because it falls around the same time of the 14th day of the first month according to the Jewish calendar.
Okay.
So just found that interesting.
Okay, I'm not sure about today, but at least I'm sure about the time of Christ. About today, I'm not really sure.
Somebody is almost saying that, but mine is maybe not necessarily that the accuracy of times, like when there's outcome to outcome, then maybe Millerites came up to October 22nd, 1843, the exact date. I don't know if it was,
Sorry?
I don't know if they used calendars compared with the one for Jewish and this one for, this is Gregorian book.
Yeah, there's this Gregorian, this is the Jewish calendar.
So question is like whether it has to be accurate or it can be approximate. Maybe it can be approximate, but we can believe it's this time, like maybe within 1 week, not the exact date. But I think that's trying to bring doubts. But like if they calculate 10 years from 32 to 1844, there is a way to Gregory's last 10 days somewhere in the middle there of this calendar. Somehow from date 5th, and tomorrow we woke up at 10th, something like that, or 15th. It's like 1 week taken away. So I haven't seen, I know maybe Millerites took time also to see those things that could maybe lead to correctness of the date. But I think the major question would be whether those years should be up to the date or the time, as I say, directly, or it could be approximate and we believe that that's happened. Yeah, something like that.
So what is the question?
So the question is whether prophecy applied or these timelines could maybe fall or maybe like before outcome, for example. Maybe we could do an event, maybe next month, maybe there's a lot of rain predicted by maybe scientists, and then it will affect event, maybe sports. Then we bring back 1 year, or we can do an event and then we call that as a fulfillment of prophecy. Or it should happen even if it rains, like prophecy will fulfill itself without us. I don't know prophecy is us doing or prophecy is us observing it happening.
All right, I've not understood your question. Can you kindly bring it during the Q&A? Because I don't think it's going to affect whatever we are going to do. All right? So I'll take away this. So I'm saying, then if you go to John chapter 1, verse 29, we are in 27 AD, but we are specifically in the atom of 27 AD. That is where we have the baptism of Christ. All right? So now I want us to move to the next chapter now. So I want us to go to chapter 2, and I want us to go to verse 13 of the chapter 2. Right? So I read, and the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Right? So verse 13, we are at a point where we have the Passover. Okay? So Linda, where are we standing in history? So we are in the 14th day of the first month. Okay? So if we move to John chapter 2, so that is verse 29 of John chapter 1. So when we go to verse 13 of chapter 2, we are on the 14th day of the first month. And we all understand why I'm saying the 14th day of the first month, because now we are at Passover. Passover only used to be celebrated on the 14th day of the first month. Now, let me just state something. So the Jewish year used to run from spring to spring. So we used to have like spring, then we have summer. After summer, we'll have the autumn, and then we'll have the winter. And then after the winter, we go to spring again. So it used to go from spring to spring. So I'm saying, even verse 29 of chapter 1, we are in the autumn of 27 AD. And when we are going to chapter 2, verse 13, we are going to see the Passover. That basically what it tells us. Therefore, we've moved from the year 27 AD, and now we are at the start of the next year. So I'm going to say loosely, without spending a lot of time, in chapter 2 now we are in the 28 AD, but the 14th day of the first month, that is the start of the year. So that is now the spring. So we've moved from autumn 27 AD, now we are in the spring, and I'm saying we are now in the spring of the next year. That is where we see the Passover there. So that is the spring of 28 AD. Okay? So now, verse 14, and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the Gentiles of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge or small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep, and the oxen, and they poured out the changers of money, and overthrew the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, deck these things, hence make not my father's house an house of merchandise. And his disciples remembers that it was written, the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. Verse 18, sorry, Bible imeraruka. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, what sign shewest thou unto us, seeing that thou dost these things? Verse 19, Jesus answered and said unto them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I raise it up. So what is happening in the verses that I've read basically is what we call the first temple cleansing. All right? So at the start of Christ's ministry, because if you read few verses, they're like from verse 1 to verse 12, you'll see like Christ has just started his ministry. So as at the start of Christ's ministry, he does a temple cleansing. That is the first temple cleansing. I think there is a quotation in, 2 SM 116, where Ellen White says, at the start of Christ's ministry, he cleansed the temple. And at the end of his ministry, Christ cleansed the temple. So when he starts his ministry, 28 AD in the spring, we have the first temple cleansing. Right? So after he has cleansed the temple, now the disciples are going to ask him a question in verse 18. So then the Jews said unto him, what sign shewest thou unto us, seeing that thou dost these things? So they are going to ask him, What are you trying to do, or what are you trying to show us by cleansing the temple? So I'm paraphrasing. So Christ is going to tell them, now destroy this temple, and in 3 days I raise it up. So which temple are they referencing, Rispa? Which temple is Christ referencing? Destroy this temple, the temple that is, this is the Jewish temple. Sindio? This is the Jewish temple. Because the conversation they are having is Christ has come to the temple from verse 13. Because why is Christ specifically going to the temple from Capernaum in verse 12? Why must he go to the temple, Amos? Yeah, to celebrate Passover. Why doesn't he celebrate Passover at Capernaum? Speak loudly. Yeah. Like Passover must be celebrated from the temple. And do we have a temple in Capernaum? No, we only have a temple in Jerusalem. So Christ must leave Capernaum to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. It was a requirement because the temple was only in Jerusalem. So when Christ is telling them, destroy this temple, is referring to the Jewish temple, that is the Herodian temple that has been in building for 46 years. Does that make sense? And now in the next verses, in verse 20, that's why they tell him, then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and will thou lay it up in 3 days? Right? Yes. Where do you get that understanding? Is it because of verse 21? Because of verse 21. All right. Yes, yes. But that is what verse 21 and verse 22 says. What you are saying. So I'm not refuting that. Yes, if you follow the previous verses, if you follow their conversation. Because I understand verse 21 now to be an application. All right. Okay. So now in verse 20, they'll tell him, so the Jews will ask him, what do you mean 40 and 6 years was the temple in building, and will thou rate up in 3 days? So verse 21 will tell you, but he, which is Christ, spake of the temple of his body when therefore he was risen. So they'll point you to the 3 days of his resurrection. But I'm saying that is one application that I don't refuse. I think on the surface level, you can see that. But I want to suggest another application that the 3 days can refer to. All right? So I'm saying one of the application is that the 3 days mentioned there are referring to the 3 days when Christ is crucified and then he resurrects. But I'm saying that anyone can see it. That is on the surface. There is another application that might make sense that I'm going to suggest. So I'm going to suggest if we take a day to be a year, this is a principle from William Miller, then the 3 days are going to refer to 3 years when Christ did its service. Right? So if we come here, 29 AD. So remember, we are in the spring of 28 AD. So 1 year is going to take you from the Passover of 28 AD to the Passover of 29 AD. Another year is going to take you from the Passover of 29 AD to the Passover of 30 AD. So everything here is spring, because that is when the Passover used to happen. And then the third year is going to take you from the spring of 30 AD to the spring of 31 AD. So we are going to have the first year, the second year, and that is going to be the third year. So I'm suggesting from 27 AD, from the autumn of 27 AD to the spring of 28 AD, we have 6 months. So these 6 months, if you combine with these 3 years, they are going to make the 3.5 years Christ did his service. And in that when they did, that is when we have the crucifixion. Christ is crucified specifically in the spring on the 14th day of the first month. All right? Okay, so keep on hand. So I want us to go back to Matthew chapter 24 now. So I want us to go back to Matthew chapter 24, which is our subject. I'm really trying to move faster because at the top of the hour we are supposed to have stopped. So now, if you go to Matthew chapter 24, verse 1, so I read, verse 1 says, "And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to shew him the buildings of the temple." So Elvina, so in verse 1 of chapter 24, we see Christ departing the temple. So parables demands us, all parable teaches us that if you see Christ departing or leaving the temple, what else must we look for? So if you are departing, what must have happened before? Like, you are understanding my question? I'd simplify. So at 1 or at 4, I'm going to leave the church. So what must I have done before? I must have entered, right? So I'm saying, if we come to Matthew chapter 24, verse 1, and we are seeing Christ departing the temple, we must therefore look the point in which Christ entered the temple. Does that make sense? Because he can only depart the temple if he entered the temple. All right? That makes sense, Elvina? All right? So when did Christ enter the temple? For him to depart in 24, verse 1. I think you must just have to go to the previous verses to realize that. So Lamech, verse 24, verse 1 is departing the temple. When must Christ have entered the temple? Pass? We pass. Azariah, do you have a clue? Festo, you get the question? What is the answer? All right, so I'm going to suggest if you go to Matthew chapter 21, right? So if you go to Matthew chapter 21, if you go a few chapters back, you can just follow that chronology. If you go to Matthew chapter 21, verse 12, you will see Christ entering the temple. So Matthew chapter 21, verse 12 says, And Jesus went into the temple of God and cast all them that sold and put in the temple and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. So what does that verse sound? Hiyo verse ina sound similar na gani? Verse 12, Ken. It sounds similar to another verse that we've read. Ina sound similar na verse gani? That is John chapter 2 verse 13. Can you see that? So I'm saying the difference is that when we were in John chapter 2 verse 13, we had the first temple cleansing. So if you come to Matthew chapter 21 verse 2, now we have the second temple cleansing. Verse 12, sorry. We have the second temple cleansing. So those are commonly the two temple cleansings that I think most of us are familiar with. So when Christ starts his ministry, he does a temple cleansing. When Christ is ending his ministry, he also does a temple cleansing, two temple cleansing, at the start of his ministry and at the end of his ministry. Yeah, that we are coming to that.
You agree that this is the second temple cleansing?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. What do you think?
No, you equated it to John 2:13, and you say that is the first temple cleansing.
Yes.
You have more evidence to show that this is now the second temple cleansing.
Yes, I can show that. So let's go to verse 1 of chapter 21. Seko, you can read.
And when they drew nigh unto Jerusalem and were come to Bethphage, unto the Mount of
So now where is Christ coming from? Bethphage, right? Uh-huh.
they're drawing nigh unto Jerusalem.
No, my understanding is, I'm open to correction. They are going to Jerusalem, they are drawing near to Jerusalem. So in that process, they'll pass through Bethphage in an attempt to go to Jerusalem. That is how I understand it. So Christ will come from Bethphage and then go to Jerusalem. Does that make sense? All right. Read.
Mount of Olives.
Mhm.
Then said Jesus to his disciples, saying unto them, go into the village over against you, and straightway ye shall find an ass tied, and a colt with her, loose them, and bring them unto me. And if any man say what unto you, ye shall say, the Lord hath need of them, and straightway he will send them.
All right. So leave it there. So which event is that in verse 2 and 3? No, not Rispa, Seko. Which event is verse 2 and 3?
Preparation for the triumphant entry into Jerusalem.
Okay, preparation for the triumphant entry to Jerusalem. And then you read, they'll actually bring that, what Christ asked, and then he's going to make the triumphant entry to Jerusalem. So what point in the life of Christ did we have the triumphant entry to Jerusalem? The start of his ministry or the end of his ministry? When did we have the triumphant entry? At the start or at the end?
You are tying me to your narrative, but
No, I'm not. I'm not. You see, there is a historical fact. I'm not making an application.
it is going to deny. But when you tie me to start or end, you will already make
All right, you tell me then. You tell me it's open. So when did we have the triumphant of entry into Jerusalem?
you are justified.
So I mean, like, if at the start of this, to answer your question simply, if at the start of his ministry, and if you see the pattern, at the start of his ministry, goes to Capernaum, then he leaves Capernaum, he goes to the temple. In Matthew chapter 21, he's coming from a different place and then goes to Jerusalem. And I'm saying verse 21, I'll give a reference that gives that history. This 4SP 250, paragraph 3, but you can read the whole of 250 and go to 254. So you realize that the triumphant entry of Christ to Jerusalem is going to happen at the end of his ministry. So he does a temple cleansing when he starts. When he's ending, he does another temple cleansing. So two temple cleansing. And there is another quote that really says it nice, but I'm not like remembering it over my head. But it should be one of the selected messages. Ellen White will say directly that at the start of Christ's ministry, he did a temple cleansing, and at the end, he did a temple cleansing. So my evidence to say that chapter 21 is at the end, is the second temple cleansing, is it's at the triumphant entry, which is the end of Christ's ministry. Because once Christ goes to Jerusalem, at this point, he never departs. So if we come to chapter 22, so once Christ enters the temple in verse 12, so you'll just spend your own time to read, he's going to teach in the temple the whole of verse 21. All right? Yes.
It's trivial, but I don't know if it would make a difference. He does enter and leave. When Christ in 21, he saw from the beginning, he leaves and then comes back. But I don't know if it's the same.
Okay, I don't know
I don't
either.
know if that matters.
Okay, I don't know either. But my understanding is, if you read the whole of verse 20, chapter 21, Christ is teaching in the temple. He'll still be teaching in the temple in verse 22. If you come to chapter 23, Christ is still teaching in the temple. So that is the words of the Pharisees. Now, when you come to verse 38, when you come to verse 38 of chapter 23, Christ is going to tell them, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. So I want us to notice the change of language. So when you go to John chapter 2, verse 13, when Christ is going to cleanse the temple the first time, he's going to tell you, make not my father's house an house of merchandise. If you come now, when he has cleansed the temple the second time, now he's telling them, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. So that is not the point of this study, but I'm saying you can see that now Christ has deforced the Jewish temple, right? At the start, when he starts his ministry as no divorce, so he calls their temple my father's house. So I just thought that that is important. So verse 38, that word desolate means destroyed. Your house has left unto you desolate. So that word desolate means destroyed. And then Christ now is going to teach in verse 24. And then in the next verse is going to be crucified. So I'm saying when we come to Matthew chapter, chapter 24, we are in 31 AD. After the triumphant entry basically happens in 31 AD. So that is the historical context. So I don't know if, but I mean like the claim I can make, if you see the whole of Matthew chapter 24 is going to be written, all is going to be spoken in the year 31 AD. The whole of it, right? So now, verse 38, Christ tells them, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth, till ye shall say, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Now we come to verse 1. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple. Remember, Christ, what he has told them in verse 38 is that, behold, your house, your temple has been destroyed. Desolate means destroyed. In verse 1, is going to depart out of the temple, right? And the disciples are going to come to Christ to show him the buildings of the temple. So why do you think, while the disciples showing Christ the building of the temple, he's been teaching in the temple, and now he has departed it, and the disciples of Christ come, and they are coming and they are showing Christ the buildings of the temple. Why?
I'm thinking they're trying to show the confusion they're having with this statement.
All right.
It makes sense for them
history of something. So when Christ says that it's going to be destroyed, they are kind of saying, this is our
What do you mean?
yeah, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Our fortress, what do you mean it's going to be destroyed?
So what is the confusion in their hair, in their minds?
I think they don't quite understand what Christ is saying.
Which is
The desolation.
the destruction of the temple. So because of the architecture, I'm going to say, because of the architecture of the temple had been built so strong. So when Christ in verse 38 is telling them, this temple is going to be destroyed, the disciples do not believe him. So they are, when he leaves the temple, they show him the architecture, the buildings of the temple. They are telling, do you really mean it that this architecture can come down? All right. So in verse 2, Christ is going to reaffirm what he says in verse 38. So in other words, I think we understand this is the common principle when we have a cause and then we have an effect. So I'm going to say verse 38 is the cause, verse 2 is going to be an effect. So Christ tells them, behold, your house has been left unto you destroyed. The temple is going to be destroyed. Or how we can call it, these are repeat and enlarge. I'm going, Matthew chapter 24, verse 2 is a repeat and enlarge of Matthew chapter 23, verse 38. So it tells them, behold, your house is going to be destroyed. The disciples are going like, what do you mean? So they are going to show him the architecture of the temple. And Christ is going to reaffirm the very thing he had said in verse 38. So in verse 2, Christ is going to tell them, and Jesus said unto them, the disciples, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. So it tells them, indeed, the temple is going to be destroyed. So now the disciples, realizing that Christ is serious with what he's saying, now in verse 3, they are going to ask, okay, before that, Steve, we know the temple, Christ tells them, behold, your temple has been destroyed. So this 31 AD, right? So in that 1 AD, Christ is going to tell them, behold, your temple has been destroyed. But we know the Jewish temple was not destroyed in that 1 AD, right? When was the Jewish temple destroyed? 70 AD. All right? So what does Christ mean when he tells them, behold, your temple has been destroyed in that 1 AD? Yes. So I think when Christ is telling them the house has been destroyed, that is an harbinger, or another word we can use is a sign, right? An earnest. All right. So we know this term, like when the temple, Manasseh is an earnest of what was going to befall the house of Israel in the time of Joachim, Joachim, and Zedekiah. See, that is why in one of the quotes Ellen White says. So I'm saying when Christ tells them, behold, your temple has been destroyed, we know the temple is only destroyed in 70 AD, so that 1 AD was supposed to be an harbinger or a sign or an earnest. An earnest basically is a down payment, right? It's a down payment of what is supposed to happen in 70 AD. Okay? So now the disciples, realizing Christ is serious, so Christ is going to reaffirm the same thing in verse 2. And he tells them, indeed, the Jewish temple is going to be destroyed. So now the disciples, realizing that Christ is serious with what he's saying in verse 3, now they are going to ask Christ some questions. And they say, verse 3 says,
So what exactly is the earnest for the
is the sign, the down payment.
in 31?
Okay. We are going to, I'm going to say, if you give us some few minutes, if we come to verse 15, we are going to show what is the sign, what is the earnest. All right? So hold on, we'll answer that. So now, when they have realized Christ is serious, now in verse 3, they are going to raise some questions to Christ. Verse 3 says, and they sat upon the Mount of Olives. The disciples came to him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? Okay? So, Esther, how many questions are you seeing in verse 3 of Matthew chapter 24? Are you there? Are you in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3? How many questions? You can even read it again. Verse 3. Okay. So I'll take an. So Matthew chapter 24, verse 3. Amanda. All right. Gitau. Question ngapi verse 3? How many questions can you read in verse 3? Tatu. Moja. So the first question is, tell us, when shall these things be? So, what? I missed the rest of your question. So the first question is, when shall these things be? All right. The second question, so what shall be the sign of thy coming? So that is one question. So two questions. All right. So two questions. When shall these things be, and what shall be the signs of thy coming and of the end of the world? So two questions, right? Pamela, this is what you said. I'm sorry. That is what you said. So three all two? Two questions, all right. Pamela, how many questions in verse 3? Sorry? Project your voice. Three questions. What are the questions? Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So 3 questions. When shall these things be? What shall be the sign of the coming? And then you cut that, the end of the world, you make it another question. What shall be the sign? Nasoma aje? Okay, what shall be the end of the world? Right. So I'll add a third question for you. Yes. All right. Sign of the end of the world. That will work. So what? The end of the world. That is correct, Pamela. 3 questions. When shall these things be? What shall be the sign of the coming? And then the last one is, what shall be the sign of the end of the world? Effie? How many questions in verse 3? 2 questions. Tell us the questions. When?
When shall these things be? And what shall be the rest of this one?
1 question. So 2 questions. All right. Carl, what do you think? How many questions in verse 3? How many can you see from just the plain reading?
I can see 3 questions,
Yes.
but the last 2
Yeah.
seem to be the same question also in a way.
All right.
Because maybe they see when Jesus comes again,
Yeah.
he goes to the end of the world.
Okay. Just from what you've said. So now we said, then if you go to chapter 38, not necessarily to you now, to the entire class. So if you go to chapter 38 and verse 2, which we said is a cause and effect, what is Christ speaking about? Azariah. Chapter 23 and verse 2, what is Christ speaking about? We said it already, it's nothing technical. Christ is speaking about the destruction of the temple. So you've already said that. So now, in verse 38 and in verse 2, Christ is speaking about the destruction of the temple, Ken. But when the disciples are going to ask the questions in verse 3, they are going to ask a question in relation to the destruction of the temple. I'm saying they are saying, when shall these things be, is the things that is spoken in verse 2, right? When is the temple going to be destroyed? All right. But again, the disciples are going to ask another question about the coming of the Son of Man and the end of the world. Where are they getting that from? Mhm. Sorry?
When this temple is destroyed,
Yes.
that's where all the buildings are there. So when it is destroyed, then it's the end of everything.
All right. That is fair. Mwangi. Christ is discussing the destruction of the temple. But the disciples, in asking their questions to Christ, they ask a question about the destruction of the temple and a question, all questions about the end of the world. Why are they sneaking in the end of the world? And Christ has been speaking about the destruction of the temple. All right. For them, is the same thing. Did you raise your hand, Joy? Yes, please.
So I wanted to say that they believe that the temple will be destroyed at the end of the world when Christ will come.
All
Which
right.
is why for me I believe is one question.
Oh, it's 1 question. So what is the question?
The question is, when shall these things be? I think the second part
Yeah.
is a repeat
And enlarge of the previous.
of the previous.
So the only question is, when shall these things be?
So in their perspective, they're only asking one question.
Okay.
One question and just expounding it.
All right. Steve. Mhm. So, but is he not literally telling them in verse 39, I'm not going to come back to the temple again until when I come the second time? All right, okay, all right, all right. So if I get you right, verse 38 is the destruction of the temple. That speaks to the first question. All right? Verse 39 is what speaks to the second, all the second and third questions, depending on what we'll agree. Okay. All right?
And just that phrase, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord, sounded like the triumphal entry, because that's what the people were
Yes.
chanting.
Yes, I agree.
So I'm just wondering, is he talking about the triumphal entry?
If you ask me, no, if you ask me, he's speaking about that, but Steve thinks otherwise.
Okay, I also think he's speaking about the triumphal entry, but now I'm confused about the chronology. Has the triumphal entry really
Come before, yeah.
So how does this work?
Okay. All right. Back here. So I think what most of you have said is correct. What happens is, we understand that Jerusalem was a walled city. Jerusalem was not like the modern day cities that are open. It was a walled city. So the disciples understand that for the temple to be destroyed, what must they first bring down? The walls of Jerusalem, okay? And they had always tied the destruction of that city with the second coming of Christ. So they know for the temple, when the temple is destroyed, what happens? The second coming comes. So that is why when Christ speaks about the destruction of the temple, for them in their minds, they know when the temple is going to be destroyed, the second of Christ is going to come. That is why when they are asking the questions in verse 3, they'll ask a question in relation to the destruction of the temple and of the end of the world. Because that is what they have in their mind. I don't know if we can call it a preconceived idea, right? So I'm just going to use compare and contrast, and this is going to help us solve how we are supposed to read verse 3. All right? Now, I'll give some preamble. We understand that compare and contrast can occur at different levels, Ochola. It can occur between two sentences following each other, or it can occur between one verse, two verses following each other, or compare and contrast can happen between two different chapters that are following one another. An example of compare and contrast of two different chapters following one another is if you go to Romans chapter 6 and Romans chapter 7. Two chapters following each other, but the relation between those two chapters is compare and contrast. All right? Another way how compare and contrast can happen, it can happen between two chapters far apart. For example, I think this is what Elder Emma has been doing in our Vespers crisis. If you go to Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 8, Daniel chapter 11, those are all the same. You can compare and contrast them. But you can see there is the Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 are far apart, but you can compare and contrast them, or how we can compare and contrast Revelation and Daniel. So I'm saying the prophecy given in Matthew chapter 24, we can find it in other gospels. By the gospels, I mean the four books: Matthew, Mark, Luke, ingine ni John. You can find that same prophecy in other gospels. So where do we find the same prophecy in other gospels? Where else can we find this prophecy? If we compare and contrast them, it's going to help us solve how we read verse 3. If it's one question, two questions, or three questions or more. Where else do we see this prophecy? Sorry, Jeff? Luke 21. Okay. Luke 21, yes. Luke 21 is fair. So I'm saying the prophecy that we see in Matthew chapter 24, we can see it in Luke 21. Where else? Mark 13. Thank you. So this prophecy, we can see it in Luke 21 and we can see it in Mark 13. So because of time, I don't want to do all the exercise we have done in Matthew chapter 24. I just want you to direct me to the specific verse in either Luke or Mark that is the same with verse 3 of Matthew chapter 24. So Penta, in Mark 13, which verse is verse 3 of Matthew chapter 24? Verse 4. All right. Mark 13. Mark 13, verse 4. Yes, verse 4 is correct. And now, if you see, I just want to comment something. When you come to the book, but I'm going to say verse 3 and 4. If you come to the book of Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, and they sat upon the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came unto him privately, saying, up to that point, that is verse 3 of Mark 13. Do you see that? Only that now when we come in Mark 13, they are going to tell us the name of the disciples that came to see Christ. So Mark 13 will tell us, and they sat upon the Mount of Olives, went against the temple. Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately. So Mark 13 is going to give us the name of the disciples that went to Christ to ask him those questions. You see that? So I'm saying verse 3 speaks to the first part, and then verse 4 is going to speak to the next part. So in verse 4, Penta, how many questions? So let me just, I'm going to compare and contrast them. So I'll have Matthew chapter 24 here, and then I'll have Mark 13, verse 3 and 4. How many questions in verse 3? How many questions do we have in that prophecy in Mark? Three questions. Tell us the questions. When shall these things be? That is the first question. So the first question is, when shall these things be? All right. So what is the next question? So the next question is, what shall be the sign? Measure of all these things. Cindy, what shall be the sign of all these things? That is the second question. The third question? Right. So tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled? That all right. Okay. No, but reconcile too. Because I understand, maybe I'm wrong, I'm not. When he says the first we tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign when these things shall be fulfilled? So it's two questions. One question on when the things will be, and the next thing is what will be the sign when these things shall be fulfilled. Maybe. Elvina? Number of questions in verse 4, Mark 13. 2. What are tell us the questions? All right. Okay. So our time is so far. So let's move to Luke. Luke 21. Luke 21. What is the equivalent of verse 3 in Luke 21? Ochola? What is the equivalent? Verse? Verse 7. So Luke 21, verse 7. I think, yeah, that's correct. So Luke 21, verse 7. Luke 21, verse 7 will say, and they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be, and what sign will be there when these things shall come to pass? So how many questions, Ochola? Sorry? Two questions. The first question is, when shall these things be? The second question is, what sign will be there when? Shall come to pass. Right? So because of time, when these things shall be fulfilled. So because of time, we don't have a lot of time. I'm going to say, if you come to Mark and Luke, those prophecies are going to give you two questions. When the things will be, and what sign will be there when the things will be fulfilled. Luke 21 will give you the same thing. When shall these things be, and what sign will be there when these things shall come to pass? But Matthew, when you come to Matthew chapter 24, it will only give you when shall these things be. So I left a space here because it doesn't answer to what shall be the sign when these things will be fulfilled. So if we look, I'm going to say, if you compare with this prophecy, it's going to give you what? What? And then this is going to give you what? What and when? Sorry. What and then it will give you when. Right? So I'm saying because we are comparing and contrasting, therefore, comparing and contrasting usually help us to fill in the space, or to fill in the information that we are not given in one prophecy, but it's given in another. So I'm saying we can come to Matthew and assume when is also there. So I'm going to say Matthew, therefore, is also going to give us when shall these things be, but it must also, using compare and contrasting, we can see the what. So, my time is over. Let me just make a conclusion. So we are in Matthew chapter 24, and we are trying to understand how to read verse 3. So the book of Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, I believe is going to give us three questions. What shall these things be? When shall be the sign of the coming of the coming, and what shall be the sign of the end of the world. When we come to the two other prophecies, they are going to give us two questions. When shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of all these things when these things will be fulfilled, rather? So I'm saying, using compare and contrasting, we can bring these questions here, and then the next time we have an opportunity, we'll read and see the questions about the end of the world. Where are they in the book of Mark and the book of Luke? So after you do that compare and contrasting, you are going to realize, therefore, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, I'm going to say we have a total of 4 questions. So we didn't have a lot of time to see. We are going to have 4 questions. 2 questions in relation to the destruction of the temple, 2 questions in relation to the end of the world. So I'm saying we can come to the all other prophecies and see we also have 2 questions. 2 questions in relation to the destruction of the temple, 2 questions in relation to the end of the world. So after you do a compare and contrast, I'm going to say you end up with 4 questions in Matthew chapter 24, verse 3, and not 2 questions, all 3 questions. 4 questions, 2 in relation to the destruction of the temple, 2 in relation to the end of the world. So our time is over. We'll end there. I know there are questions. We can try and answer them during our question and answer. Otherwise, the next time we have an opportunity, we should be able to continue with this. We pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for the opportunity you have given us to gather here as believers united by the truth. Our prayer is that as we study this precious truth, you may help us to settle onto them both spiritually and intellectually, that we cannot be moved. As we pray for lunch to have a physical meal, we pray that you may bless it and bless us and be with us throughout all this holy Sabbath. For I pray and believe in the name of Jesus Christ.